Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And, of course, we will post the program on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference, and our Internet viewers are welcome at any time to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Dr. Walid Phares has been with us at Heritage quite often in the past. He is a very prolific writer. He has served as the Middle East and terrorism expert for Fox News since January 2007. He has served as an advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives since that time as well, and is a co-secretary general of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism, a Euro-American caucus. He has briefed and testified to the U.S. Congress, the European Parliament, and the United Nations Security Council on matters related to international security and Middle East conflict. He has served on the advisory board of the Task Force on Future Terrorism of the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the Advisory Task Force on Nuclear Terrorism. Dr. Phares has taught global strategies here in Washington, D.C. since 2006. Previously, he was a professor of Middle East Studies and Comparative Politics at Florida Atlantic University. He has published more than a dozen books in English, Arabic, and French on the Middle East and international terrorism. Born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, Dr. Phares immigrated to the United States in 1990. He earned undergraduate degrees in law and political science from St. Joseph University in Beirut, a master's degree in international public law from the Université de Lyon in France, and his doctorate in international and strategic studies from the University of Miami. Fluent in Arabic and French, he has graciously decided to speak to us today in English. We are always glad to have him here, and our program today, The Lost Spring, comes at an ironic time in Washington. Just as we hope after this winter we have found spring, you're going to tell us how we may lose it again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, John. Really, this is the fifth launching from Heritage over 1 decade, and John has been gracious enough every time to introduce me more than I deserve, and open the path for a good discussion at the end. I feel that Heritage has become a NASA organization for me. We're launching these books into the space of ideas. I hope this one will find life somewhere, this new book, The Lost Spring. I'd like to thank John. I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation, the leadership of the Heritage Foundation. They're doing a great job in several realms and projects. I'd like to thank my agent, Lynn Rabinoff, the publisher, Paul Grave, all the teams who helped me, the persons who edited the book, and 2 more groups of people. One, the NGOs, the non-government organizations out of the Middle East. This book has received a lot of input from youth, from human rights, from minorities, from women's groups across the Middle East. The Arab world and the Middle East, that would include everything between Morocco and Afghanistan. Thank them very much. I have actually inscribed some of the names in the introduction and the acknowledgement. I'd like also to thank members of the U.S. Congress over the past few years who have opened their doors and opened the space for me in Congress to not just advise, as I've done since 2006, but also engage with the public, with citizens in debates and discussions, briefings, and of course hearings, and also members of the European Parliament. We have been able to put together a caucus, a North American / European caucus since 2008, dealing with the issues of international security, but that caucus TAG, Transatlantic Parliamentary Group on Counterterrorism, also dealt with the Arab Spring, also dealt with the uprisings and with civil society issues in the region. So thanking you, each one of you, for making the time to come here to Heritage Foundation, and thanking all those who are watching us online. This book, The Lost Spring, don't get it wrong. It doesn't mean that the spring is gone. It means it is a season. And in my conclusion, in that book, in this book, I am arguing that this is a season. We may have missed one of these seasons, but the next is coming. It's always a cycle. What has constituted the Arab Spring, what we call the Arab Spring, I don't know if they call themselves the Arab Spring. Of course, the names come from the name actually came from Washington, and it was linked to a description of events that took place in Central and Eastern Europe. We made the comparison with the Prague Spring and other similar movements under the Soviet occupation, the Soviet domination. This book, The Lost Spring, is basically a second volume of another book that also John introduced me to introduce the public. And that is, to me, sort of history in the making, at least at my own scale. In November of 2010, from this podium here at the Heritage Foundation, I introduced the previous book titled then, it's a very risky title, The Coming Revolution. The Coming Revolution Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. And that was, ladies and gentlemen, before the Arab Spring. So I like it or not, it has been the book that, the only book, at least in English, I have not seen in other languages, that I wouldn't say predicted. Now in the media, sometimes my friends say, well, he predicted it. Projected the trends that actually came to become social realities and political realities. The Coming Revolution was a book that was not very much read except by the experts because events came immediately. I stopped writing the manuscript on July 4th, that was symbolic, 2010, and then it was printed and made available by the end of November or mid-November. And a few weeks later, a few months later, for some countries, it exploded in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, across the Levant, of course, Syria, and beyond. Let me just go back to that book and then reintroduce now The Lost Spring as an extension of the Coming Revolution. I made several projections. And those projections in the Coming Revolution I came back to in The Lost Spring, and I verified. Projection number one was that civil societies in the Middle East have reached a level whereby they were ready to rise. Ready to rise against whom? In what ways were they organized? Did they know what was the path? All of these were great questions that were answered by events. So my finding was reading social media, crucially important, reading debates, chat rooms, engaging with intellectuals from the region. It's not enough just to read about them. You've got to engage, because in the engagement, ideas crisscross. Some among you may know that in addition to US media, European media, I go on Arab media almost every day now. And I have been doing this for many years. And in those debates, on almost all networks in the region, I would name Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, the Egyptian TV, Lebanese, Syrian. You have multiple opinions, and we engage in those discussions. So by observing social media very thoroughly for the previous years, and I have been publishing many books since 9/11, the first one, the most read, if many of my readers remember, is The Future Jihad. And in every one of these books, the post-9/11 books, I have argued that the long-term strategic response to the threat of terrorism in general, but specifically jihadi terrorism of all kinds, is not going to be kinetic. It's not going to be military. Military measures are usually deployed to counter other military measures or security measures, but a political change is the response, has been the response. So when I looked at how Arab chat rooms, Facebooks, YouTubes, and other social media were reacting to some of the events that were taking place in the Middle East a few years before the rise of the Arab Spring, I noted that several impacts, several events actually have impacted this first wave of the Arab Spring, or the one that was supposed to become an Arab Spring, a social upheaval. And I looked at four of those which I have included in my previous book, The Coming Revolution. One, obviously, were the two places where we intervened. That would be Afghanistan and Iraq. There has been a lot of discussions about the military, the counterterrorism efforts, the political ramifications, the regional, international. One aspect was not well studied, the social ramifications. The socio-political ramifications with regard civil society reacting to a sudden massive change with the fall of the Taliban and with the fall of a Ba'athist regime, Saddam Hussein. That's where I looked. In a post-Taliban Afghanistan, there was a parliament, women have participated more, and obviously to counter immediately the arguments that it is not yet Sweden, obviously it is not, and it's scheduled to go even backward when we withdraw, and if the Taliban takes over without having built a national government that can sustain and maintain the acquisition. But this is a different discussion. I was looking at the advances made, the very small advances, and small advances that goes online becomes very big advances. And I always compare those pictures of women treated under the Taliban, and some women, not all of them, in Afghanistan, and what they were able to achieve slowly in a limited fashion, but send that message around the region. Then I made the case for Iraq. Iraq maybe developed a mediocre, very difficult, contradictive democracy. Violence is all over the place. And I remind the historians among us that it took many, many decades for one of the most brilliant revolutions, the French Revolution, to settle on the Third Republic, which basically became the most stable, and then, of course, the other republics. And yet, there has been May 68 in France, even 100 years or so. So it's not, about a microwave solution to those peoples. It needs time, but it needs a direction. Time alone with a static equation won't do it. You need a change, and you need time, and of course, technology is going to be very helpful. I don't think the revolts in the Middle East are going to need another 100 years like the French one, or 50 years, probably like our democracy here. We got a civil war, we got civil rights movements, and many, many things before we settle to a liberal democracy that we are proud of, at least most of us. So those civil societies have looked at what happened in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, there was a parliament, but with one political party. After Saddam Hussein, there was a parliament with multiple political parties who throw shoes at each other and are very upset with each other. That is not the issue. It's multiple political parties. That is the advancement. But what I noticed then is that youth in the region, and to me, youth are the future. Every generation of youth is basically the next generation of adults, right? And that's a historical fact. They were looking at those two revolts that took place in the region just before the Arab Spring and looked at the tools of these revolts. One fundamental one was the Cedars Revolution in Lebanon, in Beirut, in 2005, where 1.5 to 1.8 million people took to the streets of Beirut in a very massive move. And it was made of variety of communities. Lebanon had experienced previously a 15 years war. So every time journalists in the West will talk about Lebanon, the sectarian war of Lebanon. Well, there was a moment where the silent majority of Lebanon, multi-sectarian communities came together, 1.5 to 1.8 million people, within a population of 4.5 to 5 million. We don't have the statistics in Lebanon, but that's pretty big. Only the Egyptians will be able to do so in terms of numbers, of course, proportionally speaking, last June. So one of the characteristics of that revolt, which was partially successful because as a result the international community pushed back against the then Syrian occupation of Lebanon, the Bashar regime occupation of Lebanon, and it was successful. The army withdrew. But the second part of the demand by the Cedars Revolution at the time was the disarming of all militias, including Hezbollah. It did not happen. So I did not look at the actual success. I looked at the means. I looked at the intentions, because intentions and means will be recurring will come back. And so did many in social media. So one mean was texting, SMS. It was called the SMS revolution. And that was crucial because ideas are important, but how to communicate the ideas is even as important. How could dozens of villages around the country, the small country, come together around those ideas without a tool? So when today in some countries we shut down those tools, this is very serious because that's the equivalent of deploying troops, shutting down tools. It could have different reactions. So at that time in 2005, the first nonviolent revolution in Lebanon, the Cedars Revolution, sent a strong message in the region. And I've witnessed and I saw debates and discussions about how those Lebanese, including maybe a third of the demonstrators were women and girls. This is a precedent. 4 years later came a second revolution in the Middle East, the Green Revolution in Iran, where another 1.5 to 1.8 million, we really don't have accurate numbers, but the picture shows huge masses that have never been seen before in Iran, demonstrating against the regime. Obviously, for the small parts of the story, it was triggered by a mismanagement of presidential elections. But that's not what most of these Iranians were demonstrating against or for. It was about the regime. They reached a critical moment, a critical level of rejection of the entire political culture brought about by the Khomeini regime. Now, that revolution began at least successfully by the use of an instrument, the Twitter. It was called the Twitter revolution. It was able to connect thousands and thousands. And the statistics, always very approximative statistics, tells us that about 60% of those who've demonstrated were under the age of 20. That is very much telling. In the first days, not towards the end, but in the first days, somewhere between 15 to 20% of those youth under 20 were girls in Iran. And all of us remember the one symbol of the female participation in that demonstration who was killed, Neda, N-E-D-A. So those two events sent strong messages across the Arab world. I remember after I have published a book, and I was convinced that because of what happened, there will be others. I was following very thoroughly the discussion, the formation of networks, the formation of couple groups in Egypt, including April 6th movement, in Tunisia as well, Libya's exiles. This is something that we totally missed. There's a whole chapter in the book about how the West was able to miss what was to come. I mean, if you compare with the collapse of the Soviet Union and what happened in Eastern Europe, we were very familiar with at least the movements who rose. Solidarity movement, Lech Walesa, a very famous name in Washington and in the West. Václav Havel, most of the Russian dissidents, those names were known. Either they were in exile or inside the country, in jails or elsewhere. We knew more about Central and Eastern Europe and even Russia. We knew less about the Middle East, despite the fact that, and I included this in my book as well, we have had great funding for institutions, government-backed institutions or private institutions in Washington and in Brussels to deal with civil societies. Now, the question that I raised in my book, who did we meet with? Who did these agencies and departments and organizations got their information from? That would answer everything. Did we get the right information from the right people? From those who actually led the demonstrations, not those who came as a second wave to seize the demonstrations. So my first projection was civil societies would rise. And in that same book, I did a second projection, all based on realities, that there will be a race once those regimes, or the authoritarian regimes, should they be with us, like Mubarak or Ben Ali, partners, or critical of American policies such as Assad, or other leaders, or in between, such as Gaddafi, was against us, then feared us, then modified his policy. So all of these leaders were stable dictators. My projection was, if those leaders will go down in different ways, you're not going to get a Swedish social democracy as a result immediately. That's how our collective psyche here. I mean, you have the collapse of the Bolshevik regimes, and the next day you're going to have multiple political parties, national union governments, as was the case in Central and Eastern Europe, because those countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other places, have known liberal democracy before. Even for a short period of time, they've had political parties. So they went back to what they knew before and moved forward. Then they were included by the European Union. That was not the case in the region. And the second mistake I've detected and I've built on in this book was the fact that we were not able to compare because we didn't know the actual players and actors thoroughly. I projected there will be a race between the Islamists and the seculars of all kinds, conservative, socialist, right-wing, left-wing, nationalist, and others. And the third projection was a moving projection. It depended. It's a moving parameter. It would depend really on U.S. foreign policy, on Western foreign policies, on international policies, to see how this race will be fought and will be won. Because we are all interconnected. If we favor one side, that one side has more chance to win by the way of arms, if it's an armed rebellion, or by the ways of elections. Because this is a very fragile democracy. When you do the first election in any of these countries, I projected, those who are the best organized for decades before, best funded, best media covered, what do you think they're going to do? They will win. If the other side has no funding, no organization or little organization, and is not received in the high centers of the West, such as the White House or the Strasbourg Parliament or the Congress, I mean, they don't have this visibility so that they can use this visibility in their campaign. These are the facts. French politicians don't need to do so. Irish politicians don't need to do so. But all of Middle Eastern politicians need to do so at this stage in their evolution, democratic evolution. So, to end the previous projections, I argued that whatever the U.S. policies are going to be, because I didn't know what these policies would be, I had a hint. I listened to speeches before. I mean, foreign policy here is not a secret. The president gave a speech in Cairo. It was very clear, the direction of which partner may be our partner if Mubarak goes down. Congressional hearings are open. So one was not to be very surprised as to how we will move. I mean, very few won't be surprised, but the public was not well equipped to see how we will move towards the Arab Spring. Then the Arab Spring came. Now, the first question I raise in this book, how is it that the United States and the West failed to actually project and predict? Do you remember in the first weeks of what was the Arab Spring, what was the major slogan? We don't know who they are. Who are the rebels? Even in hearings and briefings and, of course, in the media debates, there was this question about we don't know really who they are. And I was asking the question, what do you mean we don't know? Where are our political scientists and Middle East experts? We've been funding with hundreds of millions of dollars. America has spent so much money on Middle Eastern studies, bright stars, big speeches, major universities. We were not able to determine who were the forces on the ground, while by reading Arab bloggers' material, you would know who was doing what by the hour. And if you follow Twitter, by the minute. You wouldn't know the first waves of who reached Tahrir Square? You must be kidding. Because the Egyptian revolution was very simple in the beginning. Several youth groups, one of which was April 6th, was not the only one, including some Coptic organizations in Egypt. They were criticizing Mubarak's policies. They established a Facebook, Thawratu Masr, the Egyptian Revolution. And it happened, and they were surprised that in 3 days, 85,000 likes hit it. So this is a tsunami. And then the energy continued. Out of those thousands and thousands, we don't know how many, but some assessment, 30 to 40,000 went to Tahrir Square out of the 85,000. Now, afterwards, obviously, afterwards starts the analyst debates about it, that who was doing what, but that's afterwards. I'm talking about beforehand. It's a big difference between two, because afterwards everybody's speaking, everybody's talking, everybody is being interviewed by the international networks. The question I had was, why were we not able to interact with those who actually led these demonstrations? This is something that at this point in time, not even a congressional hearing will suffice. We need a historian approach to it. So Tahrir Square in Egypt, to take an example, showed that civil society had the intention, the energy, that there was a whole younger generation ready for a change, but it also taught us, as I said earlier, that they were not really ready for a major change organized. It was not a resistance movement, it was a social uprising. The lack of political parties, the lack of political movements, basically was one of the causes of the failure of the first Egyptian revolution. And these are not my conclusions. Now they are the conclusions of those who succeeded in the second Egyptian revolution. We've got to follow what the Egyptian debates is producing. And it's all in the open. Over the past 2 years, Egyptian analysts, thinkers, scholars, activists, human rights activists, women, Christian Copts, have been producing an enormous amount of explanation for the first wave, of course, the second wave. And obviously, you're going to hear from the Muslim Brotherhood, you're going to hear from Tamarrud, from others. My point is, we need to take what they say seriously, because what they say is what drives them to those activities. So, in the first chapter in the book, I run an analysis, I develop an analysis about how did we fail to predict or to project a huge movement like that. And I sometimes give examples of statements we made, our officials have made, including reports, and this is in archive now, we can go and look at, of our national security assessment of the fall. You know, every fall we have a national security assessment. So go and read it. Was there anything about the Arab Spring? Anything about 6 countries going to rise and 4 civil wars to explode? No. So that should at least question the way we are proceeding. That should at least begin to open a different type of debate about why is it that the policy level, at the media level, but in my view, at the academic level. That's where the problem is. Because once you reach the level of producing in media or having to make a decision as a policymaker or opinion maker, you're going to rely on your experts. So we need to do a little bit of digging about what's with our expert community. And that includes all of us. Is it a question of funding? Have Middle Eastern studies been receiving funding that sort of guided them what to research and what not to research? It's a very valid, legitimate question. And if you go back to Middle Eastern studies over the past decade and a half, you would see that 2 major phenomena have not been addressed thoroughly or may have been addressed wrongly. One was the rise of the jihadist movement. I remember when I emigrated to this country 24 years ago, this year, and I started to attend the sessions of the Middle East Studies Association of America, many scholars were talking about the revivalists, the Islamist revivalists. I said, what is that? It's either Islamist Salafists. I mean, let's be technical here. And they don't, they want, actually, if they want to revive anything, they want to revive the caliphate. That's reactionary. That's not revivalists. There was no realm of discussion of what the jihadist movement is, as it was in the Middle East. I looked at books by prominent experts, leading scholars. They ignored the plight of minorities. The minorities did not exist throughout the 90s, or, and over the few years after 9/11. It's only recently that this has been re-examined. So I'm calling in this book for a major re-examination now that we have ahead of us very difficult years, months and years, which I am going to be concluding about at the end. And so we need not just to re-examine our policies. We need to re-examine our ways of understanding the Middle East and detect why is it that we were not doing a good job. The first waves that hit the Arab Spring from Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, to some extent Yemen. And of course, there is the case of Bahrain and other moves here and there. But these were the major changes or the major movements. If you look at the first wave, you see a lot of similarities. You just have to go to their Facebooks. I know big scholars don't like to, this is Facebook. This is where action is. Because what you're looking at with footnoted stuff is historians' work. It's 5, 6 years later. You would feel that they are driven by very similar ideas. By ideas that are not so far from our sophisticated ideas. I mean, our liberal democracies have moved in time to a point that they would like to reach. It doesn't mean that they will be able to reach it. But that's what we saw, that's what we see. But each country obviously has its own characteristics. Tunisia already had a large segment of its society very sensitive to the idea of a liberal democracy in a sense, of a Western sense, but applied to Tunisia. Nobody follows other people's models, no one. Not even the countries that we have helped create constitutions, Japan. They always have to have their own traditions in it. Second, in those characteristics, we see that silent majorities have played a tremendous role in what happened between 2011 till recently. But silent majorities haven't had tools and instruments to express themselves. Here we have elections, we have polling, we have mass demonstration, we have referendum, we have recall processes. There, none of this existed. So what we saw, because some scholars are going to push back against what I'm saying and say, oh, well, we had the Islamists very well organized, the Brotherhood, yes, of course. The Nahda in Tunisia, absolutely. And I could even add that even in those societies, you had the left wing, you had liberals, elites, small at one edge of that sphere. If civil society is a sphere, on the one edge you have the Islamists, on the other edge you have the progressive or liberal or democratic elements or secular without being too much on the left or too much on the right. But then there's an enormous space in between. That enormous space is called silent majority. And we had many of our experts trying to figure out what did the silent majority want. I remember on Egypt, the debate here, in this country, in this city, before the Arab Spring and before what has happened, was so divided. Some would say it's an archaic society, it would never develop the ways that we have here. And that was a liberal view of it. Imagine, the liberal view do not trust people to actually develop a democracy that's sustainable. And then we have the opposing view that says, well, the Islamists will win any election, will win any referendum. Many of my colleagues actually have espoused that view, that we can't do anything about it. It's a cultural issue. I disagreed with both. Because when you take samplings from the silent majority, you will find that it is not as sophisticated as other majorities in liberal democracies where you have ways to express yourselves, but it has basic instincts, human basic instincts. People, moms, wants to send their kids to schools, and they would love to have the best schools. They don't really like religious schools. They have to send them to religious schools. And they prefer the more moderate religious schools over the Taliban-like religious schools. This is across the board, from Afghanistan, from Kandahar to Tahrir Square. This is basic. Get jobs, moving forward. So the things that we talk about, that we think our societies long for, are not so different there. What is different is that there are no political parties that can articulate these basic demands. And the political parties at the time were either supportive of the despot, of the leader, the one party that controls. It could be on the right, could be on the left, could be ultranationalist. And the opposition, the only alternative organized opposition, were the Islamists, waiting for 80 years. So silent majority moving to create a change is a very difficult issue. It's almost an impossible issue. And I still think, I'm going to use a theological term, but take it sociological. It was almost a miracle that millions were able to go on the streets of Cairo and hundreds of thousands in other places to demand a change. Now, those first waves sent messages across the board, and we in the West, we were divided about them. So there's a whole book, there's a whole chapter in my book that deals with the issue of how did we understand the Arab Spring. There's a big distance between what was the Arab Spring and how we understood it, most of us at least. If you look at those 4 or 5 examples, Egypt and Tunisia developed similar characteristics. Civil society, shocked everybody. And because it rose in Egypt so suddenly, and we saw for the first time women and men and young and Muslim moderates and Christian, and the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, it took time to make a decision to move and join the first wave. That's what the actual secular opposition against Morsi has been telling. We went first because you guys, I'm quoting, you, the Ikhwan, have done this long time ago and you were unsuccessful because the minute you descend onto the streets with your slogan of establishing an emirate or a caliphate, nobody wants that, or very few wants that except your own supporters. That's why the dictators were successful against the Islamists, because civil society would not move with the Brotherhood. This time it was different. Civil society moved, the Brotherhood watched. And when the international community said, well, these are good people, unarmed, non-violent, and even, many among us here would prefer a Mubarak over the Brotherhood, would like Mubarak because he was keeping the peace and the Suez Canal and, relationship with Israel. How many people among us were saying, oh, we don't know who these people are, let's keep Mubarak. We can't keep Mubarak if civil society rises. That's the equation. But now what we need to do, what we have needed to do, is to identify in the civil society who are the like-minded, who will be pushing towards democracy. And we made the wrong choice. The first thin move, thin wave, were the right people, the people that we should have engaged with and partnered with. It was very short-lived. There's a whole chapter on Egypt in the book, and I'm sure it's going to be a lot of arguments to push back against it because I go to the minutiae of those first weeks of the first revolution in Egypt, and I make a very serious argument. I develop a very serious argument, and I welcome the counter-arguments. I am making the argument that our foreign policy, that does not mean the entire government or the entire country, but those in charge of that Egyptian file, they have waited. Our decision on Egypt has waited. And archives are here for us to use. For the Brotherhood to become full part of that demonstration, to tell Mr. Mubarak, step down. Now, you draw your conclusions. What would that mean? We should have immediately invited the leaders of the secular movements to Washington and to Brussels and engaged them. It does not mean that we should not dialogue with the Brotherhood. Of course we should dialogue with anybody. Dialogue with anybody you want. But if you want to partner, it's a different story. Partner meaning given visibility, legitimacy, and dollars. That's a different story. That's a political choice. That is not random. So I'm arguing that That first wave could have been the third wave now. We could have actually been able to apply it across the Middle East and avoid a lot of, I don't want to use the term catastrophe, but quasi-catastrophes. Had we had an architecture, had we predicted, had we saw. Now, two places went very wrong, very fast. And I also analyzed our foreign policy at the time and also argue that we could have done it otherwise. Libya and Syria. There you have civil wars. In Libya, it was very fast, and we had the same dilemma with Gaddafi. Remember, Washington was debating Gaddafi is good, he's fighting against Al-Qaeda, but he's a dictator. And when there is a civil society rising, I know that some among us are frustrated, but we've got to move forward in life. The problem is don't move backward in life. If Gaddafi is a stable dictator that serves some of our interests, if you want to help for the replacement, don't help for bringing Salafi Jihadi militias to replace him. Move forward with civil society people. And events today in Libya are just, showing that this should have been the path. The early waves in Libya were secular, offshoot of the Gaddafi government, bureaucrats, military, diplomats on the one hand, but then Salafi jihadists. The Salafi jihadists were waiting for decades, as were the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. In Washington, both media and politicians were calling the whole thing the rebels. Well, during World War II, we knew that there was a French resistance, but we knew who was the communist and who was the pro-de Gaulle and who was the socialist, and they ended up all leaders in France later. At least the British knew. In this case, we backed the rebels in general, and we provided in Libya, what we did not provide in Syria, a whole NATO support to bring down Gaddafi. But then the problem has been bringing down Gaddafi without preparing with a partner, with a clear partner, is going to create neo-chaos or almost chaos, which is the case in Libya. Libya is divided. Benghazi, Darna, Barca is one country. Tripoli is one country with one or two, three oppositions. And I'm not even talking about the south, which is, there's an ethnic African community there ready to rise, the Tubus. And then there's a Berber community to the west. I don't want to give you all the news to come, but Libya is not where it should have been had we been ready to work with the seculars and the democratic elements. Syria seems to me the most dramatic place on the planet today. The numbers, 120,000 people killed over the past 3 years, most of whom were civilians. Many among those civilians are women and children. Most of them may have been killed by the actions of the regime, but many among them have been killed by the actions of Al-Qaeda, Jihadists, Nusra, Daesh, and others. Facts. In Syria, let me go quickly here, we had a moment, and that moment was between March of 2011 and December of 2011 and January of 2012. That moment we were in Iraq. We were still in Iraq. When our domestic politics hit foreign policy decisions, that can complicate things. By being in Iraq without debating the Iraq issue, we were simply a wall stopping Iran from moving into Syria. Third graders would understand that by looking at a map. Iran road to Syria is Iraq. It's not Turkey, it's not Jordan. Okay? So when we left Iraq, because we have to be on time for political reasons, which I'm not going to discuss, at least when we leave, let's leave behind us another wall, allies, partners, a coalition of democracy supporters. Because when we left Iraq, the Iranians moved in, because those who are in charge of Iraq are close, or most of them are close to Iran, and basically they connected with the Assad regime. Hezbollah was not in Syria in the early months of 2011, not the way they are in now. Al-Qaeda has not penetrated that deep. And we saw so many demonstrations, civil society demonstrations. So the landscape of Syria in the first 9 months was ideal for us to do something about it. Now, obviously, I'm going to get the question, what? Well, that's a whole architecture and a discussion. First, we need to understand that that moment was the moment, and second, that we could have, and third, that we could have avoided the now disasters happening in Syria. Any action against the Syrian regime today will be considered as an action against 4 regimes. The White House knows that. Congress knows that. NATO knows that now. The public doesn't realize why are we hesitating with Syria. We were so close with our ships during the crisis of the chemical weapons, and then nada, nothing. Of course, you're going to engage, we want to engage against the Assad regime in any shape or form. There is no limited engagement when you engage a power like this. You're going to engage 4 countries. And when we stopped from engaging the Assad regime, 10 days or a few days later, weeks, we declared that we have an interim nuclear deal with Iran, with the Iranian regime. So this is telling me, as an analyst, that the design in the region, for the past few years, was that we will partner with the forces that we thought would stabilize the region. The Muslim Brotherhood in North Africa, and then a reconverted Iranian leadership with whom we could do business. They would lower the uranium production from 20 to 5, and we will unfreeze, defreeze Iranian money in America, billions that will go to the regime. And it seems to me, I have read this in reports and books and research that says, engage them, do business with them, and then they will do business with you, and then they will moderate. There is one little missing link. Meanwhile, they need to reform. They need to have a Gorbachev that does glasnost, perestroika, although not successful. You need to have a signal coming from that regime that we are reforming. Of course, we'll begin to do business with you. Reforming, seizing the super oppression of your own people. Stopping the build-up of one of the largest missile fleet in the Middle East and in the world. The Iranians are telling us we're not producing nuclear material, and they are producing missiles that could send dozens of nuclear bombs in the region and beyond. How would you explain that? So in the book, I don't want to overstretch here because there are many points I want you to read. I conclude that this is a spring because we haven't understood well, we haven't reacted well. This is a spring, this wave is ending into crisis all over the place. But I have good news. There's always another spring coming. What happened in Egypt, and many debate Egypt today in this city, what happened in Egypt, despite all the problems that continue to happen to be in the country, in Cairo, is a good thing. I have never seen a civil society marching full-fledged. 33 million Egyptians. That would erase any argument. Any little argument will fall. 33 million. We have not seen in the West, on planet Earth, a demonstration with 33 million people. This is indicative of how badly people want to move forward. They want to establish a presidency with General Sisi or not. They want to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood in different ways. What is important, if you ask Egyptians today, they want a normal life. So there is a whole movement in the region of movement towards normal life. And you cannot provide normal life. It's not accepted anymore that you have a normal life and you withdraw liberties and you withdraw freedoms. And normal life with jihadi suicide bombers. So there is a new thing that has happened in the Middle East. The third wave, which I anticipate is going to rise in the next months and years. Should it be in Tunisia? We saw a piece of it. In Egypt, some demonstrations in Libya, a lot of debates in Lebanon. I will even anticipate that there will be a second green manifestation or civil society in Iran. All of this is coming. Now, the challenge is going to be what we're going to do about it. What is our Congress, our administration, these ones now and the next ones and the Europeans are going to be doing about it. That's why I offered this book, some guidelines, some information, some modest participation in the debate. And I thank you so much for coming. I'm ready to take a few questions.
I am glad you got to some optimism at some
at the
point.
end.
We will be glad to take questions. We have a microphone, and if you would be so kind as to identify yourself as a courtesy to our speaker. I would like to start out, however, in the beginning you mentioned engagement. Most people don't necessarily define engagement correctly either. Can you give me a description or a feeling of what our American engagement is at the moment? I don't think we're mentally engaged at all in the Middle East.
I argued in my book that actually we are disengaging. I used even a more dramatic term. We are on global retreat from the Middle East. For those who deal with national security and defense, we are. Arguments are very easy. We are withdrawing from the region. Not just from the places we were managing and occupying, like Afghanistan and Iraq, but in terms of commitment to allies, to such a point that our many allies, and I'm not just talking about Israel, that's very well known, but I'm talking about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Jordan, are very nervous about our policy, past policy, I don't know now for the future with the Muslim Brotherhood. They've put the organization on the list of terror organization. And with regard to Iran, Saudis and other Arab, Gulf Arabs are asking us, why is it that you went to Iran and cut a deal? And we were your partners for the last 30 years. You don't sit with us. And I mean, if it was World War II and you want to cut a deal with the remnant of a regime, you sit with the British and with the other allies. So yes, we are disengaged. But my other concern of disengagement is with civil societies. And that's visible across my book. We have not engaged civil societies. We have engaged political forces in the Middle East, which happen to be now the Muslim Brotherhood and their allies, Nahda. And again, I keep repeating, it's not that we need to cut down. You could dialogue as much as you want, but partner with the like-minded political forces you want them to see later becoming the governments in their countries.
Just a second, wait for the microphone. Sorry about us.
Yeah. So I just wanted you to remind a little bit about April 6th movement. Thank you.
Yes, sir. April 6th movement was the actual movement that began the demonstrations that later on became the first wave in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Now, April 6th movement split in factions. The sad news is that April 6th movement now is in conflict with the government, or one faction of this movement is in conflict with the government. I hope the government of Egypt will be wise enough, not just with regard to April 6th, but with all forces of the political culture of Egypt, and reorganize this freedom and democracy as we do it, as we have it here. So April movement played a tremendous role. It divided itself. Like in most post-revolutionary times, the early waves are not always the first waves for the build-up of the republic. I mean, the greatest movement that led the second revolution was Tamarrud movement, the rebellion movement. It was able to organize a petition with 22 million people. These numbers are stunning. So hopefully Egypt can figure out a way to reorganize its political life better, and there'll be less people in jail, but less jihadists in the Sinai and along the Nile.
Here, and then we'll go back to the young man at the back.
Hello, my name is Laura Dembo, and I thank you for coming here and giving us this enlightening talk. I kind of have two questions. For the next 2 years and 9 months, for however our president will be leading the world, he's sending very weak signals, and he's constantly drawing red lines, and eventually he's going to run out of red paint. So we have yet a long way to go, and so the future doesn't seem to be too bright over there. Number one, Iran is the head of the snake, and the head of the snake should be somehow been addressed, as you say, when the uprising. But I hope, I'm just very fearful of what's going on over there. And number two, I understand that the Russians are arming the Egyptians with munition and whatever. Is that the military they're arming, or can you give us a little more insight?
Let me begin with number two. Number one is very difficult to answer in less than a few minutes, but I understand your feelings and sentiments, which are expressed in the book. Many are wondering about Egypt today. And to be very clear about it, there is a strategic communication battle in Washington about Egypt. There are NGOs, foundations, consultants, be very clear about it, who are promoting the idea that the Brotherhood loss of power was due to a coup, and what we're going to see coming now is a military regime. That's one camp. Another camp, actually another group, is saying, no, what has happened is a revolution, and the revolution called on the armed forces of Egypt to come and help them, because facing them were the militias of the Brotherhood and the jihadists in the Sinai. From what I know and what I can project, Egyptians have had a long tradition of alliance with the United States. I mean, they're military in ours for the last 30 years, under the Cold War, after the Cold War, before and after 9/11. They're a very good relationship, human and institutional. They're not going to jump and become pro-Soviet, pro-Russian overnight. That's what some are trying to portray them, oh, they're leaving. But there is something else happening in Egypt. Egyptians have realized that you cannot always rely on the big powers to be there the way you want them to be there, to understand you, etc. So they're moving domestically to deal with the threat that they have, the jihadi terrorist threat, and to deal also with the political process, which is not going to be an easy thing. And on the other hand, national security and defense, they are still our partners on the one hand, but they would like to become like India is. India knows exactly what it wants, who it wants. It trades with, and it is in the camp of democracies. But it's not anymore in the camp of democracies that is told to do so, because they fear that if we make one mistake in our foreign policy towards our own partners, the loss will be big for them. They want to be actual, real partners and decide for themselves.
First part of the question?
He did not forget that. He did not forget.
I thought all of this was give you time to think.
Yes. You're a good reader of minds. I do project, sadly, that there is no mathematical equation, none, that could between now and, did you say 2016 or the next presidential elections, that could solve all these problems with the same policies that we have. I'm very objective. And I'm arguing in my book, if next week or next month the administration decides to suddenly change direction in the way I recommend, even with this administration, they can still say few things. But my question is, will they change direction? Because if you expect to solve the Syrian crisis after we have mentioned the red lines and we did not intervene or done something about it, it's quite close to impossible. To stop the Iranians from developing what they are developing after we cut a deal with them, and now we are funding them. According to the Iranians, they have received $1 billion so far through Switzerland, and we are scheduled to give more. I don't know how many, billions of dollars. Now, if you are the Iranian regime, what is it that you're going to do? You're going to continue to develop the missiles. You're going to go down maybe from 20% to 5%, but if you can go down and you have not committed, you can go up again. But more important than that, they are creating the space of geopolitical challenge. They are in Iraq. They are in Syria. They are in Lebanon. They are influencing events in Eastern Arabia, where Arabia has most of its oil. They have now been funding and training forces in northern Yemen. They have facilities in Eritrea, port of Eritrea. And most lately, they have been very active in port of Sudan. That's Sudan. We are in the Persian Gulf. They are already active in the Red Sea. I wish we had that time to do the Iran discussion, but if we don't perform a massive change of foreign policy, we won't mathematically have enough time to respond to all those. And I'm going to go 1 inch ahead, if you allow me, my friend. Even the next administration, even if you're going to have a next administration, it will be different. See how that would be something that would give joy to the opposition here? It will have tremendous problems. Any next administration will have to deal with cataclysmic issues in Syria, Iran, beyond. And I don't want to even add Russia because that's not my field.
The young man closest to you, and that'll be our last question since time's getting short.
Thank you. Christopher Mancini. You mentioned Iran and the United States not going in over the Syrian chemical weapons. Are you suggesting that that's a primary reason for not going in, or just one of the many factors?
That's an excellent question, which will prompt me to give a complicated, complex answer, which I will be happy to do so.
Give an answer. That's okay.
I will give an answer. My perception of this administration's policy with regard to Syria is about the players, meaning had they acted, they realized after 2011 and after the election that they could have done something different and imposed even on Iran a different Syria. When Turkey from the north, the Arab moderates from the south, and us, and when the president called on Mr. Assad to step down, there was this impression that the demonstrations plus someone in the military would move that would bring down Assad, a la Egypt, a la Tunisia. It did not happen that way. Because inside Syria, it's a very different ethnic religious makeup, Iran, and what have you. Now, if the projection is we take action against the Assad regime, any kind of action against the Assad regime, my analysis is that the reason for why Washington, the administration, did not engage was that Iran will crumble the deal that we have with Iran. And it is a strategic goal for the administration to have that deal, because it was told probably by its experts and interest groups that if you cut a deal with Iran, half of the problems in the Middle East are solved, and you could go and do your domestic politics and achieve. So I agree with you, but that is not the only reason. It's a massive reason for why we are not intervening in Syria, though intervening in Syria is not that simple. And you compare it with Libya. I mean, Gaddafi had no allies. He had no access. He had nobody to support him. And it was very easy to take him out, and it was made into a victory. But even when it was that easy, kinetically speaking, we partnered with the wrong people. So it's not that simple at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We, of course, do have copies of Walid's book available if you would like to purchase them. He will have some time up here to sign and talk with you a little bit further. We do thank you for your kind attention and hope you'll come back to see us again soon.
Thank you so much.